So, howdy guys. If you, hold on. If you want to scan that, you're welcome. I'll stay on this for a couple seconds more. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the divine counsel. So on the scale of how will I understand this and how much of this is going to be Bible, well, it's going to be about moderate, so nothing more difficult than you've heard this semester. However, we're going to be doing a lot of Bible tonight, so this is mainly experienced readers. If you have your Bible, I would recommend taking it out so you can look at the verses I'm going to go through. However, most of them will also be up on the screen for us to go through together. So, my presentation tonight is mainly based on Dr. Heister's book, The Unseen Realm. Dr. Heister was an expert in biblical studies and ancient Semitic languages, and he got his MA in ancient history from the University of Pennsylvania and his master's and his PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So he has a lot of background in this. So I'm not a Hebrew or Greek scholar. I'm going to be breaking down some words, but a lot of it is from him. So I'm not an expert, but he is, and I'm referencing him. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the problem that is faced by this. Then I'm going to tell you what the solution is, and then we're going to practice the solution together, and then we're going to discuss what that means for us when we read the Bible as we use this method. So our problem is that we read the Bible through a modern lens instead of in its own context, and that context would be the ancient Near East. So when you're reading the Bible, you have your own biases, church history, and modern views that we're all used to, and that is how you get your understanding of the Bible. We often try to ignore or work around odd or supernatural elements, and that can be a problem because when your filter breaks, then that can lead some people away from Christianity, so we need to be able to combat that. So this is a verse that is a really good filter breaker for some people. So this is Psalm 82:1. God, which is Elohim in the Hebrew, stands in the divine assembly. He administers judgment in the midst of the gods, which is also Elohim. So why are there two Elohims there? So that's a really good way to break your filter. So what is our solution? We need to read in the original context, which is the ancient Near East in the 2nd millennium BC and the 1st century AD. That's when these people were writing. We need to not ignore the supernatural realm, and nothing is too odd or unimportant in the Bible. If it's there and it's weird, pay attention because it means something big is happening. So let's go back to that verse that we just talked about, and let's talk about how we can break this down. So we have Elohim and Elohim. Why are these translated as two different words? Well, Elohim is in the plural form only, which means it's like sheep, deer, or moose. You can say, hey, I see a sheep, or you can say, there's a herd of sheep, and you mean different things. So we need to look at the context to figure out which Elohim it's talking about, plural or singular. So the first Elohim is in front of the singular form of stands in the Hebrew. So that tells us that it should be a singular Elohim. While the second Elohim is referring to an assembly and in the midst of, and I think we can all agree that you cannot be in the midst of one, so that tells us that that is plural. So that gives us a really good basis for that. Elohim is not strictly the name for Yahweh. It can mean something else, but does this mean that we're polytheists? Well, no. We can also see that Elohim refers to Yahweh a lot. It refers to Yahweh's counsel in Psalm 82, the gods and goddesses of other nations in Judges and Kings, demons, where the Sheddim are called Elohim in Deuteronomy, the deceased Samuel and the angels or the angel of Yahweh, and that would depend on translation. So I think we can all agree that the biblical writers are not calling the deceased Samuel the same as Yahweh. They're not giving him the same attributes or prescribing that. However, there is something that all of these figures have in common, and that is that they all inhabit the spiritual world. So we can infer from that that Elohim is not a name, it is a type of being. They are inhabitants of the supernatural realm. So, now that we know why Elohim is translated differently in verse 1, let's look at who the sons of God are later in Psalm 82. So in verse 6, it says, I have said, you are gods and sons of the Most High, all of you. However, you will die like men, and you will fall like one of the princes. So these sons of the Most High, B'nai Elyon, are called Elohim. And they're also referred to in other places as B'nai Elohim. That's fairly intuitive because most of us would agree that the Most High lines up with who God is. So these are interchangeable. So who are these people? Because I don't know right now. Well, they are divine. We see them referred to as morning stars in Job, and morning stars is strictly divine language in the ancient Near East. Ancient people believed that stars were living beings who lived in the divine realm, so that tells us that the writers are looking at the sons of God as divine, and they are described as being in heaven both in Job 38 and Psalm 89. So I think we can all agree that at this point there aren't humans in heaven for them to be referring to, so that leads us to believe that they are divine. And they're God's family. The word son is family language, right? We wouldn't call a random person our son unless we think they're a part of our family. So God created them just as he created us, and he claims us as family. He also claims them as family. And this also parallels a really common ruling structure in the ancient world where you would have a high king who had elite administrators who were often related to him that served him, and then lower level personnel that served the higher authority levels. So our parallel is that God is the high king, the sons of God are his elite administrators, and the angels, which means messenger, are the lower level personnel. So we also know that they are imagers of God. So in Genesis 1:26, God says, let us make mankind in our image and according to our likeness. And then in the next verse, it says, so God created humankind in his image. So we switch from plural to singular right after each other. And did it unplug?
Yeah. Oh, it's back.
Okay, it's back. Okay. So, there we go. So, why does this not mean that there are multiple creators? Well, if I said, hey, let's go get some pizza, guys, and let's is let us, it's a contraction, and then I went to go pick up the pizza, and I paid for the pizza and brought it back to all of you, I used a plural to say, hey, let's go get pizza, and then I still retained all of the inspiration and initiative for doing the getting of the pizza. So God includes them in the language of creating, but he is the one who retains the inspiration and initiative of creating. So he does all the creating, however he includes them. But that lets us know that they're also made in his image. So why did I say imager? Well, we can all agree that being made in the image of God equally includes men and women. It makes us distinct from earthly creation. It makes us like God in some way. And you either are or you aren't. There's no being partly made in the image of God, and you can't become made in the image of God later. So that means that we may have heard that it's an ability or property like intelligence, reasoning ability, self-awareness or sentience, or the ability to commune with God, or it's the fact that we have a soul. However, all of these unfortunately fail because all of these abilities or properties are something that animals have in part, so they might have some form of self-awareness or some emotions, though to a lesser extent, or you gain it later, because I think we can all agree that not all humans have the ability to commune with God at all times. And then the presence of a soul also fails. In Genesis, it says that in Genesis 1:30, the living nephesh is in animals, and nephesh is the Hebrew word for soul. So animals might not have a human soul, but they have a soul of some kind. So none of these things are what make us imagers of God. So that doesn't work, so what is it? Well, there's a few different ways that we can use the word in. You might be putting the dishes in the sink, referring to location. You might be breaking a mirror in pieces, which is referring to the action or the results of an action. Or you might work in education, which refers to a vocation that you have. So the image isn't an ability, it's a vocation that we have as humans. To be a human is to be the image of God. It is to image God, which is why I called us imagers. So just as we are God's imagers on earth, the divine council, the sons of God, are God's imagers in heaven. And they are not sinless. Only God is sinless. So what are their transgressions? Well, in Genesis 3, the serpent is not a mere animal. In ancient times, speaking animals are associated with magic or gods, and this, along with the New Testament passages in 2 Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians, and Revelations, tell us that the serpent is a supernatural being. So this serpent convinced Eve to eat the fruit, which led to the fall of man, and he was cursed for it. So we see that they fell also. And then we have this really interesting passage that gives us a lot of implications later down the road. In Genesis 6, 1-4, it talks about the sons of God seeing the daughters of men and that they were beautiful and taking them for wives, and the Lord condemning them, and then talking about the Nephilim being on the earth in those days and afterwards when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and bore children to them. So we have a few different views for who the sons of God are in this passage, and this is the prelude to the flood, so it's what you see right before you read about God flooding the earth. And we have a couple different views. So the Sethite view is the view that the sons of God are men in the line of Seth, and they are marrying into the ungodly line of Cain, and that is what is being condemned. And this is partly based on Genesis 4:26, when it says that either Seth or humankind, depending on your translation, begin to call on the name of the Lord. And so this fails in a few different ways. Genesis 4:26 doesn't say that the only people who called on the name of the Lord were from Seth's lineage. The women in that verse aren't called the daughters of Cain, they're called the daughters of man. So there's no actual link to Cain. And there are no Jews or Gentiles yet, so we haven't seen any prohibition against intermarriage. Also, nowhere else in the Bible is the lineage of Seth referred to specifically as sons of God. However, we do see it used to talk about supernatural beings multiple times. Then we also have the view that these are human rulers, so and they are being condemned for being in polygamous marriages. However, we don't see that Genesis 6 says these marriages were polygamous, so we kind of have to read that into the text. And the plural sons of God refers to divine beings in other Old Testament passages, so that also doesn't make the most sense. it makes more sense for us to think of these as being divine, and they had kids with humans. So we saw Nephilim earlier. Who are they? Well, I am not a Hebrew scholar, as I said. However, Michael Heister has this quote for why he says that Nephilim should not be translated as to fall or fallen, but as giant. And so he says that the spelling of the word provides a clue to where it is derived because it has two different spellings, and that consonant Y was used to mark a long vowel sound. So the second spelling shows us that it has a long Y before the plural ending was added, and that doesn't go with the word Nephal, so we would expect a different spelling for that. We also know that in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Bible that they were using during Jesus' time, it's translated as gigas, which means giant, and they're described as giants whenever they appear. So even if that Hebrew word isn't what's being translated and it isn't a borrowed word, then they're still described as giants, so we should likely be reading them as being giants. So, before the flood, we have a couple different options. So there's the normal reproduction option, and the main objection to this view is the sexual component, because in Matthew 22, it talks about humans being like angels as they are neither married nor given in marriage. So people disagree with them taking wives and having kids. But Matthew doesn't say that they can't have sex, it just says they don't. So this is a sin that I'm talking about, so them not being supposed to would make sense. We also have this view, which is the euphemistic view, and that is that they are responsible for producing the Nephilim in some way. The view of this is that it is somehow similar to how God enabled Abraham and Sarah to have a child. However, we know that they don't have the same power and they can't create out of nothing. So there are a few pitfalls with how this would actually happen. So they would likely have to become embodied in some way. But then, how are they here after the flood? It was supposed to wipe everything out, right? Well, we have two different options. There's the regional flood interpretation, which is dependent on arguments for the regional interpretation. I am not well versed in those. That's not particularly important to this. However, you can go research that if you want. But it would allow for survival outside of the flood region, which would allow the Nephilim to survive. Now, the other option is that it's a repeat sin. In Genesis 6:4, when it says, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man and had children with them, that could be translated as whenever, which would suggest that they could have fathered more Nephilim after the flood. So, we've talked about who these are, but we also have one other implication, and and you might hear that they're from the line of Noah, but we don't want to say that they're from the line of Noah, mainly because Noah was called righteous, and he was distanced from the unrighteousness. So for him to have been from one of these unions doesn't make the most sense. And also, Noah is in the line of Christ, and God would not want another Elohim to have claim to Jesus Christ. So it would make the most sense for Noah to not be of the same descent as the Nephilim. Now, our next implication is cosmic geography. In Genesis 10, we see Nimrod is called a Gibor, or a mighty man, and that is the same word used to describe the Nephilim in Genesis 6:4, right here. And he's seen as the progenitor of Assyria and Babylon, linking this to the Tower of Babel. So, at the Tower of Babel, we are all very familiar with the story. God confused the languages, he divided up the nations, but most of us don't look at the Deuteronomy 32 verses that talk about the Tower of Babel. And that says that when God gave the nations their inheritance, he fixed the borders according to the numbers of the sons of God. Your translation might say the sons of Israel. However, that doesn't make a lot of sense considering that Israel didn't exist at this point in time. So the ESV has translated this as sons of God, and that seems to be a slightly more coherent translation of this, which tells us that not only did God scatter the nations at Babel, he divided them among the sons of God. And that gives us a view where the world is divided up into nations which are divided up among the sons of God who have power over those areas. Our next hint at the cosmic geography is in 1 Samuel. We see that David here laments that he's been driven away from sharing in the inheritance of Yahweh. That inheritance language is the same inheritance language in Deuteronomy 32, and in his mind, David can't worship Yahweh since he's outside of Israel, because the land outside of Israel was given to other gods. So that's another hint that we have some sort of geographical lines being drawn here. Our other example is Naaman. Naaman was the commander of the Syrian army. He was affected by leprosy, and in 2 Kings 5, he decides to seek out the prophet Elisha for a cure at the suggestion of a captive Israelite girl. So Elisha doesn't initially meet with him, but he sends a messenger to tell him to wash in the Jordan 7 times so that he will be healed. Naaman eventually does this and returns to Elisha proclaiming that God is the only God and he will not sacrifice to any god except for Yahweh. But to do this, when he goes back to Syria, he asks to take some dirt with him so that he can sacrifice to Yahweh, even though he is outside of Israel. Our other really big passage is Daniel 10, and this is probably the clearest view that we have. So in Daniel 10, a divine being comes to give Daniel a vision, and he tells Daniel that he was delayed by the prince of Persia, and that Michael, one of the chief princes who we know as the archangel, had to come assist him so that he could bring the vision to Daniel. Biblical scholars pretty much all agree that the princes in this passage are divine beings. And then we also see this reflected in Paul's writings. He uses a lot of language that is tied to cosmic geography. The word that he uses for rulers of this age and the rulers in heavenly places and the prince of the power of the air is archon. And the Septuagint translates Michael, the chief of the princes, and the prince of Persia as archon and archonton, which are the same word. This version is just plural. So that tells us that Paul is very familiar with this view of cosmic geography. He also uses these terms interchangeably with a few others you might recognize: powers, principalities, authorities, powers, dominions, and lords and thrones. And then in Ephesians 3:10, we see that only after Christ had risen was God's plan made known to the ruler and the authorities in the heavenly places, and God and Jesus took the nations back, which is why we are no longer bound by these cosmic geographic lines. So, in conclusion, if you read the Bible, it needs to make sense within its own context. That doesn't mean ignoring the church fathers or your modern view. It just means remembering that that's not how it was written. Don't dismiss the supernatural parts of the Bible just because they're weird. If it's weird, it's probably important, and it has implications on how you understand the world. And if there is an odd or weird passage, like I said, it's important. Don't ignore it or filter it out or try to work around it. So that has been our talk today on the Divine Council. Again, this is based on The Unseen Realm by Michael Heister. I used the 2015 version, and thank you. Do we have any questions?
Sons of God or the Nephilim when they transgressed against God? I guess not who you're claiming. Is like Heiser claiming like all of them have transgressed against God, or just the ones that we like Lucifer and those that we know have fallen?
Yes. So Heiser is saying that they, as a category, are not perfect. So we know the serpent, who we know as Satan, transgressed, and then the fallen sons of God. He does not include the righteous sons of God in that. So there would be ones that are good. Sorry, I should have clarified that earlier. Thank you. Yes, Alyssa.
So you talk about them having like sort of cosmic geography, like
Mhm.
areas and nations that they're ruling over. Is that in the same way that the angels of the seven churches rule over the churches, like in Revelations, or is it like they were physically on earth, like kind of like kings on thrones?
So that question is if this is if the way they rule over nations in cosmic geography is similar to in Revelation, where the angels rule over the seven churches, or if they were on earth. I would say that it's more coherent to think about them as ruling or having power from heaven. However, they can become embodied in certain ways. We see that with the serpent. He takes the form of a serpent on earth, even though he is still divine. So in some way they can become embodied. So there might be points where they are on earth and ruling in some fashion, but likely they are ruling from the supernatural realm.
Sorry, I have a follow-up.
Yes.
So do you think that the people of the time were aware that they were being ruled by sons of God? In the sense that they knew who their son of God were, or do you think it's kind of like now where nations wouldn't? I don't think there's nations right now that would acknowledge that they're being
So would they know that they are being ruled over by a son of God? I don't know that they would have necessarily known that. However, the gods and goddesses of other nations are typically included in that category. So like the Egyptians worshipped their gods. They would be considered sons of God and that have fallen, along with Baal, as was mentioned earlier, that was being worshipped. So in some capacity, they probably knew that they were in some way ruled over by these sons of God. However, they probably didn't have the same understanding of it that an Israelite would have, like David, we can see, had in that passage. Julie, yes.
So this kind of sheds a little light on, it's been so weird to think, we always think that idols don't have any power. There's
Mm-hmm.
was it Elijah who said, who was on the top of the mountain and God brought fire on his sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
the other priests were praying to Baal and he, made fun of him because he's not real. But on this view, it's almost like, yeah, the physical idol Baal is nothing, is not a thing, is no power. But is it a summoning type of thing where the god of that country, or like Baal, the pagan god, could inhabit what they, so that they really thought that the idol, that the god was real?
Yeah. So do idols have absolutely no power, or do they have some sort of power through these sons of God? So we obviously can't know 100% because we don't live back then when they were doing this a lot. We don't see it a lot now. However, they had ceremonies for opening the mouths of idols where they thought that their God came into the idols. So we see some sort of view of this summoning type language there. And even if that didn't happen, worship has power on its own. So them worshiping these false gods was likely giving that God's some sort of worship or power over them. And even if that wasn't necessarily through the idol itself made of wood and stone, that was there in some form or fashion. Will?
Going off of her question on, do you think that they knew that they were worshiping the sons of God? Do you think that that's whenever the Egyptians used to see their rulers, their pharaohs, as actually gods just coming down to this world? Do you think that that has any weight in it? Could the sons of God that ruled over that area have actually come down to embody a human vessel, or just be on earth and be ruling in that sort of fashion?
So could the view of the Egyptians and other people in that time of their kings being the sons of God mean that the sons of God came to inhabit them? I think that's definitely a possibility. We're getting a little bit into speculation here, and when we get into speculation, we can't base it on biblical text, so we're kind of saying, oh, this is an interesting idea, and that could have happened. From what we see, it definitely could have happened. Do we know that that's what they did? No, but it's definitely an interesting idea and could give a little more weight to what God did with the plagues, where he went through and attacked some of the Egyptian gods with those plagues. And I also think that that brings up a really good point, that another really interesting thing is that if we claim that these gods and goddesses of other nations don't exist at all, we're saying that God is greater than things that don't exist, and I think that really diminishes that statement that we all go by. So viewing them as fallen sons of God makes that statement a little bit more weighty for us. Landry?
Does Heister say anything about what these divine beings are doing now, at least in the sense of post-resurrection of Jesus?
Yeah, so Heiser does talk about that quite a bit in his section on the kingdom already and the kingdom not yet. So they don't rule over geographic areas necessarily anymore because Christ came and reclaimed the nations. However, they haven't been fully defeated. They're still working on the earth. So that's probably what most of us have a view of demons doing, where they can influence us, they can tempt us to sin, and we have to battle that as believers. So they have some power here on earth still because the battle is not over. However, we know that they are fully defeated in Christ. Emma, again.
This might also be getting into speculation, but there were the sons of God over each geographic area, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we also saw in the Bible people were demon possessed.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. To me, that seems like it wouldn't be the governing Legion, for example. That was
Yeah.
so I would assume that wouldn't just be the overarching Son of God
Mm-hmm.
of that region, who is the Legion, which is plural. So is there does Heiser say whether there's structure or hierarchy among the fallen sons of God?
Yeah, so how would demons be possessing someone since there's a ruling son of God? How would that work? Heiser doesn't get into it specifically, but we do have that really good parallel of that structure with the High King, the elite administrators, and then low-level personnel. That can give us a pretty good idea that they probably had some of those elite administrators that are the ruling sons of God, took some of those low-level personnel with them, and they would probably have them working for them. There's also some distinction between the sons of God and demons in the Bible, because the Shedem is the word for demon, and they're called Elohim, but they're never really in the same verse as sons of God. So the equation of demons versus sons of God is a little bit messy and really gets into that speculation side. So there's a chance that they're the same thing being referred to as different things. There's also a chance that they're completely different And I'm going to be honest, I don't really have a really good answer for if they're the same or not. Alex?
I have a bit of a follow-up question about the hierarchy. Like angel, I guess like, what exactly does divine mean? Are angels divine? 'Cause, I don't know, you talk about morning stars, but like Satan is like a, I don't know, like he's understood as God, one of the sons of God, but he's a demon who's also identified as a morning star, I think.
So I think a really interesting thing is, like you said, like, are these really divine or are they not? So specifically, the sons of God, I would say, are divine. However, Elohim is kind of an overarching term for supernatural inhabitants, since we see Samuel being called that after death when he's brought back to talk to King Saul. So I am not like super sure. However, I would say that likely demons would not be considered divine in the same sense as the sons of God, and obviously we probably wouldn't call Samuel divine. However, the word divine also isn't used in the Bible. I'm using that to express a point. So supernatural and divine here kind of slightly interchangeable, not really, but we don't have like clear evidence from the Bible that specifically divine is the correct word. You could also use supernatural and it would mean pretty much the same thing. We also see later that Paul talks about, in the New Testament, it talks about us becoming greater than the angels, which the word angels is translated from one of those cosmic geography words that I talked about. And so we see that in some sense we eventually take on some level of divine characterization in that when we become greater than the angels. But again, a lot of that is kind of speculation. And it really depends on what you're saying by the word divine, because most of us would agree that the sons of God aren't really gods. They're a lower level version of this supernatural creature, and God is the highest. So we're kind of splitting hairs when we get into that. Will?
So it talks about in Revelation that like whenever it's talking about Satan being cast down, it says that like the dragon and his angels fought against God, and then he swept his tail, and like a third of the stars fell down. So when like the third of the angels that are in heaven being cast down with Satan, wouldn't those could those angels be the like so-called like low level like stars or people that maybe are the ones that like possess people, and then the sons of God are more of the higher level people?
So that could definitely be an option. Something else is that angel isn't necessarily a category of being like we think of it as. Angel means messenger, so it's really describing a job that they have as a messenger. So we could have angels at some points being angels and delivering messages, but they could have other roles outside of that, and we don't have a really good biblical, like, this is how it is. A lot of this is speculation that we're getting into, but that's definitely a way that we could see that. Yes?
Sorry, I came in late, so
Yeah.
I'm kind of catching up on context here. Just to rephrase, like I'm getting everything right. You're arguing that there's these sons of God that are not obviously God, but are distinct from angels. Is that your argument?
So if the sons of God are distinct from angels, like I said, angel is a word for messenger, or malach in the Hebrew.
Would like seraphim be angels?
So seraphim would be a category of those sons of God that I'm talking about. So typically we don't see seraphim translated as angels, or if it is, we're kind of mistranslating it there when we talk about them, since angel does mean messenger. So if they are not performing the duty of delivering a message. Referring to them as an angel isn't really the correct term. That's why we see archangel being used for Michael, because we tend to call all of these supernatural beings angels, and we needed something to say he's one of the chief princes, like it calls him in Daniel 10. So I would say that when I'm talking about the low-level personnel likely being angels, I'm using angels as a stand-in for like the kind of jobs they might be doing, such as being messengers or serving under those elite administrators. So there is that structure there, but we also don't know for sure that angels is its own class of being. We only know for sure that it's a job that some of these beings perform.
And yeah, and my follow-up question there is, so this like this spiritual being that has, I guess, various different classes, you're arguing that it's made in the image of God?
Yes, so that is based on some verses that we went over in Genesis, so 126 and 127. In 126, it talks about let us make man in our own image, and then in the second verse, 127, it talks about God making man in his image. So I'm not a Hebrew. So like I said, I'm not a Hebrew scholar. However, there has been research into the Hebrew grammar there that points towards that view not being very coherent and that it likely doesn't mean the Trinity. Also, Samuel made a really good point earlier that switching back and forth between the plural and the singular there, and just us saying that, oh, it probably refers to the Trinity, and they're loosely switching back and forth because God is both 3 and 1 at the same time, and he's 3 in 1. So that kind of logical, why would they switch back? And we don't have a really clear idea of why they would switch back if they're just referring to the Trinity. And also that Hebrew grammar research shows that the Trinity is probably not the best view, so seeing it as the divine counsel is probably a better interpretation.
Or could it not be just like the royal we? I mean, that's like very common within, and like it would just be a demonstration of both like royalty and personal relationship.
Yeah, so I think again that kind of goes.
The royal we? No, that's just not true. Like the royal we has existed for thousands of years.
So I think that kind of goes back to the why would it switch from one verse to the next between those two? And it specifically only in that one statement says let us when God is speaking, and then all of the rest of the time it says that he created them in his image. So like I said, that is an option. That's not like an incorrect interpretation. I'm not arguing that it is. I'm just arguing that, and Heister mainly is arguing that based on the Hebrew grammar, it's likely not the best interpretation.
Yeah, because I would say my concern in this would be that it seems strange that God would create other entities in his own image that thus have like a supreme dignity as a natural consequence of that, but not make any efforts as to redeem those creatures. I would say like the chief point of the redemption of man is that man bears the image of God and ought to ultimately be in union with him and thus redeemed. So I would say that there, and I would also say that like for example with like Jesus he talks about how many people Jesus baptizes, but there's no record of Jesus actually baptizing anybody. It's like the apostles that are baptizing on behalf. I would say that would it not make sense that they're referring to let us, like referring to like the either the royal we or just those assisting God in the creation of the world does not necessarily mean that they bear his image precisely.
Yeah, so something that's really interesting, you just mentioned those who are assisting God. In Psalm 89, it actually talks about the sons of God being there when God laid the foundations of the universe. So that gives us another tie-in to why we might think that they are the ones he is speaking to, because we see the sons of God being there when he laid the foundations of the earth, which would imply they were there when he created man. So those who assisted him, we don't want to say that the Trinity assisted him in that, because the Trinity is God and God is doing the creating. So if we're going to say that someone assisted him in creation, I would say that the most logical thing to think is that the sons of God did that. However, again, I think that God did all the creating. Like I said earlier, I might say, hey, let's go get pizza, and I'm saying that all of us should be getting pizza, but then I go and I pick it up and I pay for it and I bring it back for all of us to eat and share in. And I am talking in the plural, but then doing all the stuff, and y'all are just sharing in it.
Right. And so I guess that still like leads with my follow-up question of why would God? It seems strange that God would not redeem something that also still bears His image.
Yeah. So again, that's not something I have a really clear answer for. We don't get a direct answer for that. So I think that my best answer for that would be that in a similar way to them being called God's family in heaven, we're referred to as God's family on earth, and we were given the charge to subdue the earth and take over it and be God's representatives on earth. So it makes a little bit of a parallel to say that they are God's representatives and his helpers in heaven as well.
That didn't answer the question. The question is, why does God not redeem something that bears His nature?
So I think there's two ways you can look at it. One, and correct me if I say something that is against Scripture.
Yeah, sorry. I don't mean to be super aggressive.
No, you're good.
Sorry.
But Jesus is fully man and fully God, fully Elohim.
Right.
And so I think it would make sense that his sacrifice saved both human and Elohim if they are, in fact, in the image of God. But I also think it would make sense for God to, if he were to redeem them, to do so in the spiritual realm. Like he redeemed humanity in humanity's own realm. And so I think, we don't exist necessarily in the spiritual realm until death. And so we can't see exactly and know that he's not redeeming them. I think it's entirely possible and in the character of God that he would redeem them just in their own realm or in their existence.
And I'll butt in here real quick. It's probably the last thing before you might have to head outside.
Yeah.
But it's pretty clear when you look at how Paul interprets the cross, also how Peter does, that the cross has cosmic implications. I guess for us, First Peter says he went to proclaim to the spirits in prison. So however you want to take that, like there's a message of interpreted as doom by some, like these Nephilim that would have rebelled in Genesis 6. But there's a corollary, I think, that like implications are more than just for humans or for the whole cosmos in general. And I think that kind of answers your question. Like the cross is not just the redemption of you and me. It is that, but it's so much more.
Creation.
Yeah, creation is Romans 8 has these cries for groaning to be redeemed. So I think it might make a similar point about the cosmos in general.
That's right.
Yeah, I also think another really interesting thing is that, just tying into that, it does talk about how that the plan was not known to them until that, and why it doesn't make sense for God to hide a plan unless they were actively fighting the plan. So we see more active resistance. Satan was the one doing the deceiving. The serpent deceived Eve on purpose. The serpent rebelled against God. Even Adam were deceived and fell into sin because of that deception. So we see a difference between being deceived and having a wrong view and that leading to sin versus actively knowing who God is and what he is and choosing that he is incorrect and you think your way is better. And so we kind of see two different types of falls there, and they're not exactly equivalent. And I think that's probably good. We'll head out to the tables. Thank you all for coming, and feel free to ask me more questions out there.